Ibn Battuta described the situation of Granada as unequaled by any city in the world. Around it on every side are orchards, gardens, flowering meadows, vineyards, and in it noble buildings. Its Arabic name was Karnatah, of uncertain meaning. Its Spanish conquerors christened it Granada, full of seeds, probably from the neighboring abundance of the pomegranate tree. The name covered not only the city, but a province that included Xeres, Jaén, Almeria, Malaga, and other towns, with a total population of some 4 millions. The capital, with a tenth of these, rose like a watchtower to a summit commanding a magnificent valley, which rewarded careful irrigation and scientific tillage with 2 crops a year. A wall with 1,000 towers guarded the city from its encompassing foes. Mansions of spacious and elegant designs sheltered the aristocracy. In the public squares, fountains cooled the ardor of the sun, and in the fabulous halls of the Alhambra, the emir or sultan or caliph held his court. 1/7 of all agricultural produce was taken by the government, and probably as much by the ruling class, as a fee for economic management and military leadership. Rulers and nobles distributed some of their revenue to artists, poets, scholars, scientists, historians, and philosophers, and financed a university where learned Christians and Jews were allowed to hold chairs and occasional rectorships. On the college portals, 5 lines were inscribed. The world is supported by 4 things: the learning of the wise, the justice of the great, the prayers of the good, and the valor of the brave. Women shared freely in the cultural life. We know the names of feminine savants of Moorish Granada. Education, however, did not prevent the ladies from stirring their men not only to swelling passions, but to chivalric devotion and displays. Said a gallant of the time, "The women are distinguished for the symmetry of their figures, the gracefulness of their bodies, the length and waviness of their hair, the whiteness of their teeth, the pleasing lightness of their movements, the charm of their conversation, and the perfume of their breath." Personal cleanliness and public sanitation were more advanced than in contemporary Christendom. Dress and manners were splendid, and tournaments or pageants brightened festive days. Morals were easy, violence was not rare, but Moorish generosity and honor won Christian praise. The reputation of the citizens of Granada for trustworthiness, said a Spanish historian, was such that their bare word was more relied on than a written contract is among ourselves. Amid these high developments, the growth of luxury sapped the vigor of the nation, and internal discord invited external attack. Christian Spain, slowly consolidating its kingdoms and increasing its wealth, looked with envious hostility upon this prosperous enclave, whose religion taunted Christianity as an infidel polytheism, and whose ports offered dangerous openings to an infidel power. Moreover, those fertile Andalusian fields might atone for many a barren acre in the north. Only because Catholic Spain was divided among factions and kings did Granada retain its liberty. Even so, the proud principality agreed in 1457 to send annual tribute to Castile. When a reckless emir, Ali Abu al-Hassan, refused to contribute this bribe to peace in 1466, Henry IV was too busy with debauchery to compel obedience. But Ferdinand and Isabella, soon after their accession to the throne of Castile, sent envoys to demand resumption of the tribute. With fatal audacity, Ali replied, "Tell your sovereigns that the kings of Granada who paid tribute are dead. Our mint now coins nothing but sword blades." Unaware that Ferdinand had more iron in him than was in the Moorish mint, and claiming provocation by Christian border raids, Abu al-Hassan took by assault the Christian frontier town of Zahara and drove all its inhabitants into Granada to be sold as slaves, this in 1481. The Marquis of Cadiz retaliated by sacking the Moorish stronghold of Alhama in 1482. The conquest of Granada had begun. Love complicated war. Abu al-Hassan developed such an infatuation for one of his slaves that his wife, the Sultana Ayesha, roused the populace to depose him and crown her son Abu Abdallah, known to the West as Boabdil, in 1482. Abu al-Hassan fled to Malaga. The Spanish army marched to besiege Malaga. It was almost annihilated in the mountain passes of the Ajarquia range by troops still loyal to the fallen emir. Jealous of his father's martial exploits, Boabdil led an army out from Granada to attack a Christian force near Lucena. He fought bravely, but was defeated and taken prisoner. He obtained his release by promising to aid the Christians against his father and to pay the Spanish government 12,000 ducats a year. In the meantime, his uncle, Abu Abdallahi, known as Azagral, the Valiant, had made himself emir of Granada. A three-cornered civil war ensued among uncle, father, and son for the Granadan throne. The father died, the son seized the Alhambra, the uncle retired to Guadix, whence he emerged repeatedly to attack Spaniards wherever he could find them. Stirred to imitation, Boabdil repudiated pledge and tribute and prepared his capital to resist inevitable assault. Ferdinand and Isabella deployed 30,000 men to devastate the plains that grew Granada's food. Mills, granaries, farmhouses, vineyards, olive and orange groves were destroyed. Malaga was besieged to prevent its receiving or sending supplies for Granada. It held out until its population had consumed all available horses, dogs, and cats, and were dying by hundreds of starvation or disease. Ferdinand forced its unconditional surrender, condemned the 12,000 survivors to slavery, but allowed the rich to ransom themselves by yielding up all their possessions. Az-Zagral submitted. The entire province of Granada outside its capital was now in Christian hands. The Catholic sovereigns built around the beleaguered citadel a veritable city for their armies, called it Santa Fe, and waited for starvation to deliver the pride of Andalusia to their mercy. Moorish cavaliers rode out from Granada and dared Spanish knights to single battle. The knights responded with equal gallantry, but Ferdinand, finding that his best warriors were being killed one by one on this chivalric plan, put an end to the game. Boabdil led out his troops in a forlorn sally, but they were beaten back. Appeals for help were sent to the sultans of Turkey and Egypt, but no help came. Islam was as divided as Christendom. On November 25, 1491, Boabdil signed terms of capitulation that did rare honor to the conquerors. The people of Granada were to keep their property, language, dress, religion, ritual. They were to be judged by their own laws and magistrates. No taxes were to be imposed till after 3 years, and then only such as Moslem rulers had levied. The city was to be occupied by the Spanish, but all Moors who wished to leave it might do so, and transportation would be provided for those who wished to cross to Moslem Africa. Nevertheless, the Granadans protested Boabdil's surrender. Insurrection so threatened him that he turned the keys of the city over to Ferdinand on January 2, 1492, and rode through the Christian lines, with his relatives and 50 horsemen, to the little mountain principality which he was to rule as a vassal of Castile. From the crags over which he passed, he turned to take a last look at the wonderful city that he had lost. That summit is still called El Ultimo Sospiro del Moro, the last sigh of the Moor. His mother reproved him for his tears. "You do well to weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." Meanwhile, the Spanish army marched into Granada. Cardinal Mendoza raised a great silver cross over the Alhambra, and Ferdinand and Isabella knelt in the city square to give thanks to God, who after 781 years had evicted Islam from Spain. 3. Ferdinand and Isabella. The century between the death of Henry of Trastamara in 1379 and the accession of Ferdinand to the throne of Aragon was a fallow time for Spain. A series of weak rulers allowed the nobles to disorder the land with their strife. Government was negligent and corrupt. Private vengeance was uncurbed. Civil war was so frequent that the roads were unsafe for commerce, and the fields were so often despoiled by armies that the peasants left them untilled. The long reign of John II, from 1406 to 1454, of Castile, who loved music and poetry too much to care for the chores of state, was followed by the disastrous tenure of Henry IV, who by his administrative incompetence, his demoralization of the currency, and his squandering of revenue on favored parasites, earned the title of Enrique el Impotente. He willed his throne to Juana, whom he called his daughter. The scornful nobles denied his parentage and potency, and forced him to name his sister Isabella as his successor. But at his death in 1474, he reaffirmed Juana's legitimacy and her right to rule. It was out of this paralyzing confusion that Ferdinand and Isabella forged the order and government that made Spain for a century the strongest state in Europe. The diplomats prepared the achievement by persuading Isabella, 18, to marry her cousin Ferdinand, 17, this in 1469. Bride and bridegroom were both descended from Henry of Trastamara. Ferdinand was already king of Sicily. On the death of his father, he would be also king of Aragon. The marriage, therefore, wed 3 states into a powerful kingdom. Paul II withheld the papal bull needed to legalize the marriage of cousins. The requisite document was forged by Ferdinand, his father, and the Archbishop of Barcelona. After the fait had been accompli, a genuine bull was obtained from Pope Sixtus IV. A more substantial difficulty lay in the poverty of the bride, whose brother refused to recognize the marriage, and of the bridegroom, whose father, immersed in war, could not afford a royal ceremony. A Jewish lawyer smoothed the course of true politics with a loan of 20,000 sueldos, which Isabella repaid when she became Queen of Castile in 1474. Her right to the throne was challenged by Afonso V of Portugal, who had married Juana. War decided the issue at Toro, where Ferdinand led the Castilians to victory in 1476. 3 years later he inherited Aragon. All Spain except Granada and Navarre was now under one government. Isabella remained only Queen of Castile. Ferdinand ruled Aragon, Sardinia, and Sicily, and shared in ruling Castile. The internal administration of Castile was reserved to Isabella, but royal charters and decrees had to be signed by both sovereigns, and the new coinage bore both the regal heads. Their complementary qualities made Ferdinand and Isabella the most effective royal couple in history. Isabella was incomparably beautiful, said her courtiers, that is, moderately fair, of medium stature, blue eyes, hair of chestnut brown, verging on red. She had more schooling than Ferdinand, with a less acute and less merciless intelligence. She could patronize poets and converse with cautious philosophers, but she preferred the company of priests. She chose the sternest moralists for her confessors and guides. Wedded to an unfaithful husband, she seems to have sustained full marital fidelity to the end. Living in an age as morally fluid as our own, she was a model of sexual modesty. Amid corrupt officials and devious diplomats, she herself remained frank, direct, and incorruptible. Her mother had reared her in strict orthodoxy and piety. Isabella developed this to the edge of asceticism, and was as harsh and cruel in suppressing heresy as she was kind and gracious in everything else. She was the soul of tenderness to her children, and a pillar of loyalty to her friends. She gave abundantly to churches, monasteries, and hospitals. Her orthodoxy did not deter her from condemning the immorality of some Renaissance popes. She excelled in both physical and moral bravery. She withstood, subdued, and disciplined powerful nobles, bore quietly the most desolating bereavements, and faced with contagious courage the hardships and dangers of war. She thought it wise to maintain a queenly dignity in public, and pushed royal display to costly extravagance in robes and gems. In private, she dressed simply, ate frugally, and amused her leisure by making delicate embroideries for the churches she loved. She labored conscientiously in the tasks of government, took the initiative in wholesome reforms, administered justice with perhaps undue severity, but she was resolved to raise her realm from lawless disorder to a law-abiding peace. Foreign contemporaries like Paolo Giovio, Guicciardini, and Chevalier Bayard ranked her among the ablest sovereigns of the age, and likened her to the stately heroines of antiquity. Her subjects worshipped her, while they bore impatiently with the king. The Castilians could not forgive Ferdinand for being a foreigner, that is, an Aragonese, and they found many faults in him even while they gloried in his successes as statesman, diplomat, and warrior. They contrasted his cold and reserved temperament with the warm kindliness of the queen, his calculated indirectness with her straightforward candor, his parsimony with her generosity, his illiberal treatment of his aides with her open-handed rewards for services, his extramarital gallantries with her quiet continence. Probably they did not resent his establishment of the Inquisition, nor his use of their religious feelings as a weapon of war. They applauded the campaign against heresy, the conquest of Granada, the expulsion of unconverted Jews and Moors. They loved most in him what posterity would least admire. We hear of no protest against the severity of his laws, cutting out the tongue for blasphemy, burning alive for sodomy. They noted that he could be just, even lenient, when it did not hinder personal advantage or national policy. that he could lead his army dauntlessly and cleverly, though he preferred to match minds in negotiation rather than men in battle, and that his parsimony financed not personal luxuries but expensive undertakings for the aggrandizement of Spain. They must have approved of his abstemious habits, his constancy in adversity, his moderation in prosperity, his discerning choice of aids, his tireless devotion to government, his pursuit of far-seen ends with flexible tenacity and cautious means. They forgave his duplicity as a diplomat, his frequent faithlessness to his word. Were not all other rulers trying by like methods to cozen him and swindle Spain? "The King of France," he said grimly, "complains that I have twice deceived him. He lies, the fool. I have deceived him 10 times and more." Machiavelli carefully studied Ferdinand's career, relished his cunning, praised his deeds, all great and some extraordinary, and called him the foremost king in Christendom. And Guicciardini wrote, "What a wide difference there was between the sayings and doings of this prince, and how deeply and secretly he laid his measures." Some accounted Ferdinand lucky, but in truth his good fortune lay in careful preparation for events and prompt seizure of opportunities. When the balance was struck between his virtues and his crimes, it appeared that by fair means and foul he had raised Spain from a motley of impotent fragments to a unity and power that in the next generation made her the dictator of Europe. He cooperated with Isabella in restoring security of life and property in Castile, in reviving the Santa Hermandad, or Holy Brotherhood, as a local militia to maintain order, in ending robbery on the highways and sexual intrigues at the court, in reorganizing the judiciary and codifying the laws, in reclaiming state lands recklessly ceded to favorites by previous kings, and in exacting from the nobles full obedience to the crown. Here, too, as in France and England, feudal freedom and chaos had given way to the centralized order of absolute monarchy. The municipal communes likewise surrendered their privileges. The provincial cortes rarely met, and then chiefly to vote funds to the government. A weak-rooted democracy languished and died under an adamantine king. Even the Spanish Church, so precious to los reyes católicos, or the Catholic sovereigns, a title conferred upon Ferdinand and Isabella by Pope Alexander VI in 1404, was shorn of some of its wealth and all of its civil jurisdiction. The morals of the clergy were rigorously reformed by Isabella. Pope Sixtus IV was compelled to yield to the government the right to appoint the higher dignitaries of the Church in Spain, and able ecclesiastics like Pedro González de Mendoza and Jiménez de Cisneros were promoted to be at once archbishops of Toledo and prime ministers of the state. Cardinal Jiménez was as positive and powerful a character as the king. Born of a family noble but poor, he was dedicated in childhood to the Church. At the University of Salamanca, he earned by the age of 20 the doctoral degrees in both civil and canon law. For some years he served as vicar and administrator for Mendoza in the Diocese of Sigüenza. Successful but unhappy, caring little for honors or possessions, he entered the strictest monastic order in Spain, the Observantine Franciscans. Only asceticism delighted him. He slept on the ground or a hard floor, fasted frequently, flogged himself, and wore a hair shirt next to his skin. In 1492, the pious Isabella chose this emaciated cenobite as her chaplain and confessor. He accepted, on condition that he might continue to live in his monastery and conform to the rigid Franciscan rule. The order made him its provincial head, and at his bidding submitted to arduous reforms. When Isabella nominated him Archbishop of Toledo in 1495, he refused to accept, but after 6 months of resistance he yielded to a papal bull commanding him to serve. He was now nearly 60, and seems to have sincerely wished to live as a monk. As primate of Spain and chief of the royal council, he continued his austerities. Under the splendid robes required by his office, he wore the coarse Franciscan gown, and under this the hair shirt, as before. Against the opposition of high ecclesiastics, but supported by the Queen, he applied to all monastic orders the reforms that he had exacted from his own. It was as if St. Francis, shorn of his humility, had suddenly been endowed with the powers and capacities of Bernard and Dominic. It could not have pleased this somber saint to find 2 unconverted Jews high in favor at the court. One of Isabella's most trusted counselors was Abraham Señor. He and Isaac Abravanel collected the revenue for Ferdinand and organized the financing of the Granada War. The king and queen were at this time especially concerned about the conversos. They had hoped that time would make these converts sincere Christians. Isabella had had a catechism specially prepared for their instruction. Yet many of them secretly maintained their ancient faith and transmitted it to their children. Catholic dislike of the unbaptized Jews subsided for a time, while resentment against the new Christians rose. Riots against them broke out in Toledo in 1467, Valladolid in 1470, Cordova in 1472, and Segovia in 1474. The religious problem had become also racial, and the young king and queen pondered means of reducing the disorderly medley and conflict of peoples, languages, and creeds to homogeneous unity and social peace. They thought that no better means were available for these ends than to restore the Inquisition in Spain. 4. The methods of the Inquisition. We are today so uncertain and diverse in our opinions as to the origin and destiny of the world and man that we have ceased, in most countries, to punish people for differing from us in their religious beliefs. Our present intolerance is rather for those who question our economic or political principles, and we explain our frightened dogmatism on the ground that any doubt thrown upon these cherished assumptions endangers our national solidarity and survival. Until the middle of the 17th century, Christians, Jews, and Muslims were more acutely concerned with religion than we are today. Their theologies were their most prized and confident possessions, and they looked upon those who rejected these creeds as attacking the foundations of social order and the very significance of human life. Each group was hardened by certainty into intolerance and branded the others as infidels. The Inquisition developed most readily among persons whose religious tenets had been least affected by education and travel, and whose reason was most subject to custom and imagination. Nearly all medieval Christians, through childhood schooling and surroundings, believed that the Bible had been dictated in every word by God, and that the Son of God had directly established the Christian Church. It seemed to follow from these premises that God wished all nations to be Christian, and that the practice of non-Christian, certainly of anti-Christian religions, must be a crass insult to the deity. Moreover, since any substantial heresy must merit eternal punishment, its prosecutors could believe, and many seemed to have sincerely believed, that in snuffing out a heretic they were saving his potential converts, and perhaps himself, from everlasting hell. Probably Isabella, who lived in the very odor of theologians, shared these views. Ferdinand, being a hardened man of the world, may have doubted some of them, but he was apparently convinced that uniformity of religious belief would make Spain easier to rule and stronger to strike its enemies. At his request and Isabella's, Pope Sixtus IV issued a bull on November 1st, 1478, authorizing them to appoint 6 priests, holding degrees in theology and canon law, as an inquisitorial board to investigate and punish heresy. The remarkable feature of this bull was its empowerment of the Spanish sovereigns to nominate the inquisitorial personnel, who in earlier forms of the Inquisition had been chosen by the provincial heads of the Dominican or Franciscan orders. Here, for 3 generations, as in Protestant Germany and England in the next century, religion became subject to the state. Technically, however, the inquisitors were only nominated by the sovereigns and were then appointed by the Pope. The authority of the inquisitors derived from this papal sanction. The institution remained ecclesiastical, an organ of the Church, which was an organ of the state. The government was to pay the expenses and receive the net income of the Inquisition. The sovereigns kept detailed watch over its operations, and appeal could be made to them from its decisions. Of all Ferdinand's instruments of rule, this became his favorite. His motives were not primarily financial. He profited from the confiscated property of the condemned, but he refused tempting bribes from rich victims to overrule the inquisitors. The aim was to unify Spain. The inquisitors were authorized to employ ecclesiastical and secular aides as investigators and executive officers. After 1483, the entire organization was put under a governmental agency, the Consejo de la Suprema y General Inquisición, usually termed the Suprema. The jurisdiction of the Inquisition extended to all Christians in Spain. It did not touch unconverted Jews or Moors. Its terrors were directed at converts suspected of relapsing into Judaism or Mohammedanism, and at Christians charged with heresy. Till 1492, the unchristened Jew was safer than the baptized. Priests, monks, and friars claimed exemption from the Inquisition, but their claim was denied. The Jesuits resisted its jurisdiction for half a century, but they too were overcome. The only limit to the power of the Suprema was the authority of the sovereigns, and in later centuries even this was ignored. The Inquisition demanded, and usually received, cooperation from all secular officials. The Inquisition made its own laws and procedural code. Before setting up its tribunal in a town, it issued to the people, through the parish pulpits, an edict of faith, requiring all who knew of any heresy to reveal it to the inquisitors. Everyone was encouraged to be a delator, to inform against his neighbors, his friends, his relatives. In the 16th century, however, the accusation of near relatives was not allowed. Informants were promised full secrecy and protection. A solemn anathema, that is, excommunication and curse, was laid upon all who knew and concealed a heretic. If a baptized Jew still harbored hopes of a Messiah to come, if he kept the dietary laws of the Mosaic Code, if he observed the Sabbath as a day of worship and rest, or changed his linen for that day, if he celebrated in any way any Jewish holy day, if he circumcised any of his children, or gave any of them a Hebrew name, or blessed them without making the sign of the cross, if he prayed with motions of the head, or repeated a biblical psalm without adding a Gloria, if he turned his face to the wall when dying, these and the like were described by the inquisitors as signs of secret heresy, to be reported at once to the tribunal. Within a term of grace, any person who felt guilty of heresy might come and confess it. He would be fined or assigned a penance, but would be forgiven, on condition that he should reveal any knowledge he might have of other heretics. The inquisitors seem to have sifted with care the evidence collected by informers and investigators. When the tribunal was unanimously convinced of a person's guilt, it issued a warrant for his arrest. The accused was kept incommunicado. No one but agents of the Inquisition was allowed to speak with him. No relative might visit him. Usually he was chained. He was required to bring his own bed and clothing, and to pay all the expenses of his incarceration and sustenance. If he did not offer sufficient cash for this purpose, enough of his property was sold at auction to meet the costs. The remainder of his goods was sequestered by Inquisition officers lest it be hidden or disposed of to escape confiscation. In most cases, some of it was sold to maintain such of the victim's family as could not work. When the arrested person was brought to trial, the tribunal, having already judged him guilty, laid upon him the burden of proving his innocence. The trial was secret and private, and the defendant had to swear never to reveal any facts about it in case he should be released. No witnesses were adduced against him, none was named to him. The inquisitors excused this procedure as necessary to protect their informants. The accused was not at first told what charges had been brought against him. He was merely invited to confess his own derelictions from orthodox belief and worship, and to betray all persons whom he suspected of heresy. If his confession satisfied the tribunal, he might receive any punishment short of death. If he refused to confess, he was permitted to choose advocates to defend him. Meanwhile, he was kept in solitary confinement. In many instances, he was tortured to elicit a confession. Usually, the case was allowed to drag on for months, and the solitary confinement in chains often sufficed to secure any confession desired. Torture was applied only after a majority of the tribunal had voted for it on the ground that guilt had been made probable, though not certain, by the evidence. Often the torture so decreed was postponed in the hope that dread of it would induce confession. The inquisitors appear to have sincerely believed that torture was a favor to a defendant already accounted guilty, since it might earn him by confession a slighter penalty than otherwise. Even if he should, after confession, be condemned to death, he could enjoy priestly absolution to save him from hell. However, confession of guilt was not enough. Torture might also be applied to compel a confessing defendant to name his associates in heresy or crime. Contradictory witnesses might be tortured to find out which was telling the truth. Slaves might be tortured to bring out testimony against their masters. No limits of age could save the victims. Girls of 13 and women of 80 were subjected to the rack. But the rules of the Spanish Inquisition usually forbade the torture of nursing women, or persons with weak hearts, or those accused of minor heresies, such as sharing the widespread opinion that fornication was only a venial sin. Torture was to be kept short of permanently maiming the victim, and was to be stopped whenever the attendant physician so ordered. It was to be administered only in the presence of the inquisitors in charge of the case, and a notary, a recording secretary, and a representative of the local bishop. Methods varied with time and place. The victim might have his hands tied behind his back and be suspended by them. He might be bound into immobility and then have water trickled down his throat till he nearly choked. He might have cords tied around his arms and legs and tightened till they cut through the flesh to the bone. We are told that the tortures used by the Spanish Inquisition were milder than those employed by the earlier Papal Inquisition or by the secular courts of the age. The main torture was prolonged imprisonment. The Inquisition tribunal was not only prosecutor, judge, and jury. It also issued decrees on faith and morals and established a gradation of penalties. In many cases it was merciful, excusing part of the punishment because of the penitent's age, ignorance, poverty, intoxication, or generally good reputation. The mildest penalty was a reprimand. More grievous was compulsion to make a public abjuration of heresy, which left even the innocent branded to the end of his days. Usually the convicted penitent was required to attend Mass regularly, wear his San Benito, a garment marked with a flaming cross. He might be paraded through the streets, stripped to the waist and bearing the insignia of his offense. He and his descendants might be barred from public office forever. He might be banished from his city, rarely from Spain. He might be scourged with 100 or 200 lashes to the limit of safety. This was applied to women as well as men. He might be imprisoned or condemned to the galleys, which Ferdinand recommended as more useful to the state. He might pay a substantial fine or have his property confiscated. In several instances, dead men were accused of heresy, were tried post-mortem, and were condemned to confiscation, in which case the heirs forfeited his bequests. Informers against dead heretics were offered 30 to 50% of the proceeds. Families fearful of such retroactive judgments sometimes paid compositions to the inquisitors as insurance against confiscation of their legacies. Wealth became a peril to its owner, a temptation to informers, inquisitors, and the government. As money flowed into the coffers of the Inquisition, its officials became less zealous to preserve the orthodox faith than to acquire gold, and corruption flourished piously. The ultimate punishment was burning at the stake. This was reserved for persons who, judged guilty of serious heresy, failed to confess before judgment was pronounced, and for those who, having confessed in time and having been reconciled or forgiven, had relapsed into heresy. The Inquisition itself professed that it never killed, but merely surrendered the condemned person to the secular authorities. However, it knew that the criminal law made burning at the stake mandatory in all convictions for major and impenitent heresy. The official presence of ecclesiastics at the auto da fe frankly revealed the responsibility of the Church. The act of faith was not merely the burning, it was the whole impressive and terrible ceremony of sentence and execution. Its purpose was not only to terrify potential offenders, but to edify the people, as with a foretaste of the Last Judgment. At first the procedure was simple. Those condemned to death were marched to the public plaza. They were bound in tiers on a pyre. The inquisitor sat in state on a platform facing it. A last appeal for confessions was made. The sentences were read. The fires were lit. The agony was consummated. But as burnings became more frequent and suffered some loss in their psychological power, the ceremony was made more complex and awesome, and was staged with all the care and cost of a major theatrical performance. When possible, it was time to celebrate the accession, marriage, or visit of a Spanish king, queen, or prince. Municipal and state officials, Inquisition personnel, local priests, and monks were invited, in effect required, to attend. On the eve of the execution, these dignitaries joined in a somber procession through the main streets of the city to deposit the green cross of the Inquisition upon the altar of the cathedral or principal church. A final effort was made to secure confessions from the condemned. Many then yielded and had their sentences commuted to imprisonment for a term or for life. On the following morning, the prisoners were led through dense crowds to a city square. Impostors, blasphemers, bigamists, heretics, relapsed converts. In later days, Protestants. Sometimes the procession included effigies of absent condemnees or boxes carrying the bones of persons condemned after death. In the square, on one or several elevated stages, sat the inquisitors, the secular and monastic clergy, and the officials of town and state. Now and then the king himself presided. A sermon was preached, after which all present were commanded to recite an oath of obedience to the holy office of the Inquisition, and a pledge to denounce and prosecute heresy in all its forms and everywhere. Then one by one the prisoners were led before the tribunal, and their sentences were read. We must not imagine any brave defiances. Probably, at this stage, every prisoner was near to spiritual exhaustion and physical collapse. Even now he might save his life by confession. In that case, the Inquisition usually contented itself with scourging him, confiscating his goods, and imprisoning him for life. If the confession was withheld till after sentence had been pronounced, the prisoner earned the mercy of being strangled before being burned. And as such last-minute confessions were frequent, burning alive was relatively rare. Those who were judged guilty of major heresy but denied it to the end were, till 1725, refused the last sacraments of the Church, and were, by the intention of the Inquisition, abandoned to everlasting hell. The reconciled were now taken back to prison. The impenitent were relaxed to the secular arm, with a pious caution that no blood should be shed. These were led out from the city between throngs that had gathered from leagues around for this holiday spectacle. Arrived at the place prepared for execution, the confessed were strangled, then burned. The recalcitrant were burned alive. The fires were fed till nothing remained of the dead but ashes, which were scattered over fields and streams. The priests and spectators returned to their altars and their homes, convinced that a propitiatory offering had been made to a god insulted by heresy. Human sacrifice had been restored. 5. Progress of the Inquisition, 1480 to 1516. The first inquisitors were appointed by Ferdinand and Isabella in September 1480 for the district of Seville. Many civilian conversos fled to the countryside and sought sanctuary with feudal lords. These were inclined to protect them, but the inquisitors threatened the barons with excommunication and confiscation, and the refugees were surrendered. In the city itself, some conversos planned armed resistance. The plot was betrayed. The implicated persons were arrested. Soon the dungeons were full. Trials followed with angry haste, and the first auto de fe of the Spanish Inquisition was celebrated on February 6, 1481, with the burning of 6 men and women. By November 4th of that year, 298 had been burned. 79 had been imprisoned for life. In 1483, at the nomination and request of Ferdinand and Isabella, Pope Sixtus IV appointed a Dominican friar, Tomás de Torquemada, Inquisitor General for all of Spain. He was a sincere and incorruptible fanatic, scorning luxury, working feverishly, rejoicing in his opportunity to serve Christ by hounding heresy. He reproved inquisitors for lenience, reversed many acquittals, and demanded that the rabbis of Toledo, on pain of death, should inform on all Judaizing conversos. Pope Alexander VI, who had at first praised his devotion to his tasks, became alarmed at his severity, and ordered him in 1494 to share his powers with 2 other inquisitors general. Torquemada overrode these colleagues, maintained a resolute leadership, and made the Inquisition an imperium in imperio, rivaling the power of the sovereigns. Under his prodding, the Inquisition at Ciudad Real in 2 years, from 1483 to 1484, burned 52 persons, confiscated the property of 220 fugitives, and punished 183 penitents. Transferring their headquarters to Toledo, the inquisitors within a year arrested 750 baptized Jews, confiscated a fifth of their goods, and sentenced them to march in penitential processions on 6 Fridays, flogging themselves with hempen cords. 2 further autos da fe in that year, 1486, at Toledo, disciplined 1,650 penitents. Like labors were performed in Valladolid, Guadalupe, and other cities of Castile. Aragon resisted the Inquisition. When, nevertheless, it set up its tribunal there, some conversos assassinated an inquisitor in 1485. It was a mortal blunder, for the shocked citizens thronged the streets crying, "Burn the conversos!" The archbishop calmed the mob with the promise of speedy justice. Nearly all the conspirators were caught and executed. One leaped to his death from the tower in which he was confined. Another broke a glass lamp, swallowed the fragments, and was found dead in his cell. In Valencia, the Cortes refused to allow the inquisitors to function. Ferdinand ordered his agents to arrest all obstructors. Valencia gave way. In support of the Inquisition, the king violated one after another of the traditional liberties of Aragon. The combination of church and monarchy, of excommunications and royal armies, proved too strong for any single city or province to resist. In 1488, there were 983 condemnations for heresy in Valencia alone, and 100 men were burned. How did the popes view this use of the Inquisition as an instrument of the state? Doubtless resenting such secular control, moved presumably by humane sentiment, and not insensitive to the heavy fees paid for dispensations from Inquisition sentences, several popes tried to check its excesses and gave occasional protection to its victims. In 1482, Sixtus IV issued a bull which, if implemented, would have ended the Inquisition in Aragon. He complained that the inquisitors were showing more lust for gold than zeal for religion, that they had imprisoned, tortured, and burned faithful Christians on the dubious evidence of enemies or slaves. He commanded that in future no inquisitor should act without the presence and concurrence of some representative of the local bishop, that the names and allegations of the accusers should be made known to the accused, that the prisoners of the Inquisition should be lodged only in episcopal jails, that those complaining of injustice should be allowed to appeal to the Holy See, and all further action in the case should be suspended until judgment should be rendered on the appeal, that all persons convicted of heresy should receive absolution if they confessed and repented, and thereafter should be free from prosecution or molestation on that charge. All past proceedings contrary to those provisions were declared null and void, and all future violators of them were to incur excommunication. It was an enlightened decree, and its thoroughness suggests its sincerity. Yet we must note that it was confined to Aragon, whose conversos had paid for it liberally. When Ferdinand defied it, arrested the agent who had procured it, and bade the inquisitors go on as before, Sixtus took no further action in the matter, except that 5 months later he suspended the operation of the bull. The desperate conversos poured money into Rome, appealing for dispensations and absolutions from the summons or sentences of the Inquisition. The money was accepted, the dispensations were given, the Spanish inquisitors, protected by Ferdinand, ignored them, and the popes, needing the friendship of Ferdinand and the Anates of Spain, did not insist. Pardons were paid for, issued, and then revoked. Occasionally the popes asserted their authority, citing inquisitors to Rome to answer charges of misconduct. Alexander VI tried to moderate the severity of the tribunal. Julius II ordered the trial of the inquisitor Lucero for malfeasance, and excommunicated the inquisitors of Toledo. The gentle and scholarly Leo, however, denounced as a reprehensible heresy the notion that a heretic should not be burned. How did the people of Spain react to the Inquisition? This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.